COVID reckoning for Anthony Fauci in the US Congress. But where is Bill Gates? We've got a major scapegoating incident going on. Not to say that Anthony Fauci has no responsibility. Of course, he has a lot of responsibility. But where is Bill Gates? Where is everybody else? Where are the prosecutions? Where are the prosecutions? We will be talking about that today, and I'm going to be giving you a little map of responsibility for the COVID scare in this and other podcasts. Now that Anthony Fauci is back in the news, I think it's going to be interesting for all of us. This is Management of Reality. I am Francisco Gil White, your friendly anthropologist. And this is our English language podcast of 20 August 2026. All right, let's get into it. So let me first start you off with our man in the news. Our man in the news is Dr. Anthony Fauci. If you don't remember this, because the COVID crisis is now so far in your rear view mirror that you can't even remember what happened, I'll tell you. Anthony Fauci was the guy telling everybody what to do. Okay. He was the guy telling the US government what to do in the COVID crisis, and other governments around the world were copying what Anthony Fauci said, because the US government it's got a lot of soft power and a lot of real power. And so what happens in the United States is very influential everywhere. And Anthony Fauci was doing the same thing they were doing in the UK. And together that became like a prestige juggernaut. And lots of countries copied everything that Anthony Fauci said. Now, Anthony Fauci is now in the news again because several things have happened. One is that his diary, or at least the portion of his diary that corresponds to the COVID crisis, that has become public. And it turns out that in private, in his diary, Anthony Fauci basically said that the conspiracy theorists were right. Everything that we conspiracy theorists were yelling about during the COVID crisis, Anthony Fauci confesses privately in his diary. So this is producing a minor scandal. Anthony Fauci is being subpoenaed to testify before Congress. Rand Paul has been interrogating him, as he is fond of doing. And Anthony Fauci has been taking the fifth pretty much about anything that he is asked. So he's giving zero testimony. But meanwhile, the contents of his diary are becoming public. And as I said, we can see in his diary that he was lying to us, and that he privately agreed with what the people who were condemned as conspiracy theorists were saying all along. Now, this is the guy who gave Anthony Fauci the, let us say, we should really call it pseudoscientific support for everything that Anthony Fauci did. Okay, this guy is Neil Ferguson. And I will get into more detail about who Neil Ferguson is, but he's the modeler, these are very long words, epidemiological modeler, okay, the guy making these mathematical simulations to forecast what was supposedly going to happen with COVID. All right, that's what I mean by epidemiological modeler, mathematical modeler. Okay, that's Neil Ferguson. He is a professor at Imperial College and was employed by the World Health Organization as well, and by the UK government. We'll get to that. So his models are the ones that produced all of the recommendations that almost everybody followed. And if you want to read about him, I'm going to be discussing today what is in this article. Okay. It's called "This Professor Stopped the World. Was That Incompetence?" And you're going to be hearing what's in this article today. All right. Okay. So I'm going to be asking Yoel to share images with us as I give you my reading of what happened here. All right. So I'm going to start with two quotes. One is from the National Review, a conservative publication in the United States. The National Review says, Neil Ferguson has been wrong, quote, Neil Ferguson has been wrong so often that some of his fellow modelers call him the master of disaster, end of quote. Here's another quote. This one is from the American Institute for Economic Research. Neil Ferguson, and no, Yoel, we should have an image of Neil Ferguson right now, just so that you know what we're doing. Yeah, there you go. Neil Ferguson and Imperial College played a preeminent role in shutting down most of the world. The exaggerated forecasts of this modeling team are now impossible to downplay or deny, and extend to almost every country on Earth. Indeed, they may well constitute one of the greatest scientific failures in modern human history, end of quote. They're talking about Neil Ferguson, the guy who told us that the COVID crisis was going to be tremendous, and whose recommendations everybody followed, okay? So who's the most powerful professor in the world? Well, that would have to be Neil Ferguson. I mean, he stopped the planet. Take that, Superman. How did Ferguson do that? Well, he did it by crying apocalypse. At the start of the COVID crisis, Ferguson announced that in the following 4 months, 2,200,000 people would die in the US, and another 500,000 people would die in the United Kingdom. Now, in another podcast, I'm going to be talking about Bill Gates's responsibility, okay? But I want to make it clear right now so that you understand that Ferguson is not just some individual or an especially important modeler. No, Ferguson's work has been bankrolled by Bill Gates, okay? Very important to understand that. And Bill Gates is also bankrolling the World Health Organization, the WHO, okay? So this Neil Ferguson is not some kind of independent actor. He is deeply enmeshed within the structure that Bill Gates has created. Bill Gates has been making, see, Yoel, you could be showing us Bill Gates right now, or the WHO. See, there you go. This is what I need you to do. Thanks. So Bill Gates has taken over the WHO with his enormous investments in, because he gives money directly to the World Health Organization. Actually, more than any other government now, I think, even more than the U.S. government. I forget the exact figures, but we have them in an article that we're going to share with you soon. It's going to be in the description. And Bill Gates is also paying for the modelers at Imperial College, where this Neil Ferguson works. And Bill Gates is bankrolling the health ministries. He's sending a lot of money to the health ministry in the UK, to the CDC and the NIH in the United States, and so forth. Bill Gates has his fingers in everything. Okay, so when we talk about Neil Ferguson, it's important to remember we're always talking about Bill Gates, because Bill Gates is the guy who controls Neil Ferguson and everything Neil Ferguson says. Okay, Bill Gates is paying for Ferguson. He's paying for the health ministries that follow Ferguson's recommendations, and he's paying for the World Health Organization that makes the recommendations of the health ministries kosher. Bill Gates is paying for all of it, okay? So let's see. We will talk in more detail in my next podcast on this topic. We will talk in more detail about Bill Gates, but today is about Neil Ferguson. But I really need you to remember, Bill Gates is behind everything that Neil Ferguson did. Okay. So anyway, as I was saying, at the start of the COVID crisis, this Neil Ferguson announced that in the following 4 months, 2,200,000 people would die in the US and another 500,000 people in the UK. People listened because Ferguson was, quote, the epidemiologist the whole world listens to, end of quote. That's a headline from a French newspaper. You can show it now. There you go. They say in French, l'épidémiologiste que tout le monde écoute face au COVID-19, right? The epidemiologist that everybody listens to in face of COVID-19. And it says there in the subtitle that Emmanuel Macron, Donald Trump, and Boris Johnson, they were all following his recommendations, okay? What were his credentials? He was director of the Collaborating Center for Infectious Disease Modeling of the World Health Organization, for one. He was a prominent member of the UK government's Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, or SAGE. And from these twin perches, he established a solid track record. He could reliably influence policy in response to his catastrophic alarms, despite always being completely wrong. This is quite amazing. He's always been wrong. I will get into this. COVID was not the exception. After the WHO, the World Health Organization, endorsed Ferguson's Diluvian forecast, the UK government did exactly what Ferguson recommended and imposed lockdowns, which steamrolled a citizen's freedom of movement and assembly. Soon after, the US government followed suit. Not long after that, a fundamental human right famously anchored in the Nuremberg Code, the right to refuse a medical intervention, the right not to be treated as a lab rat, was abolished with the imposition of quote unquote vaccine mandates to inoculate us with an experimental mRNA therapy. These draconian policies, which frankly shredded the Western constitutional order, were quickly copied elsewhere. And it was all justified, all of it, on the presumed catastrophe that Neil Ferguson had forecast. Yet Ferguson got it completely wrong. When the official numbers of deaths were tallied for the 4 months contemplated in his computer model, they came in at between 7% and 8% of his predictions. And that was despite the fact that authorities everywhere, the World Health Organization, the health ministries, the hospitals, everybody, they were all collaborating to inflate the numbers to make COVID seem much worse than it actually was. And we have an article about the inflation in the numbers, how they did that. We'll put it in the description as well. Ferguson had made absolutely ridiculous assumptions in order to get his equally ridiculous numbers. Quote, he assumed, for example, that in the absence of a lockdown, people would do nothing whatever to protect themselves from COVID. This was contrary to all experience of human behavior as well as to data available at the time. End of quote. To explain that such a small fraction of predicted deaths took place, Ferguson and his team simply said that without lockdowns, their model predictions would have been just right, which of course has been called, quote, a ludicrously unscientific exercise, end of quote. Because what if their projections had simply been absurd? That should also be considered. And the way to find out is to compare the predictions to the natural experiments, because some countries didn't lock down or very little. How did they do? For those countries, it turns out Ferguson's projections were just insanely bad. So take Sweden, for example. I think we have the chart on Sweden there. Yeah, you can see there, that's the excess mortality for Europe in the period 2020-2022. And you can see there at the bottom that Sweden did way better than other European countries, way better, and way better than the US. So but the US did more than twice as badly as Sweden. Forgive me, is that the UK or the US? The UK. And the US did more than 3 times as badly as Sweden. Okay. Why? Because the chief epidemiologist in Sweden, the government's epidemiologist, I forget his name right now, he thought Ferguson was crazy, and he refused to follow Ferguson's recommendations. In that country, the one that refused to follow Ferguson's recommendations is the best performer in Europe. Okay. Another example is Taiwan. In no lockdown Taiwan, for example, Ferguson's overestimate of deaths was off by almost 1.8 million%. Here, almost any layperson's wild guess would have done better than Ferguson's expert model. So why the COVID lockdowns? Yes, people died. COVID is a killer. I'm not denying that, but so are other diseases. Cancer and heart disease, for example, the leading causes of death in the US, each killed around twice as many people in the United States as COVID did in 2020. And that's without considering that the official COVID statistics are grossly inflated, as we show in the article that we will put in the description. Yet the world economy was never shuttered for cancer or heart disease. We just grieve our dead and we go on. Why couldn't we do the same with COVID? Why the COVID lockdowns? The question is sharpened into a slicer by these twin facts. First, bureaucrats responded eagerly to Ferguson's predictions and recommendations, despite the fact that any child of 4 could see that no reason existed to take Ferguson seriously when he said anything at all, given that Ferguson had always been spectacularly, outrageously wrong. And second, those bureaucrats, so anxious to impose lockdowns on this flimsiest of cases, obviously understood that they were going to inflict, as they did inflict, the most profound, incalculable damage on the human species. This damage turned out to be much worse than COVID, and Ferguson's lockdowns made the impact of COVID itself worse. And all of that was foreseeable by competent decision makers. So we should like to know whether Ferguson and these bureaucrats were acting out of sheer mammoth incompetence, or whether this was something more sinister. Let us state clearly the 2 hypotheses. First, the incompetence hypothesis. Incompetence says the following: Neil Ferguson cannot evaluate how dangerous a pathogen is. He can neither properly model an epidemic nor make reasonable recommendations for public health policy. His bosses can neither process rationally and skeptically what Ferguson produces, nor themselves think on their own about the problem before them. And they're not smart enough to hire someone who can model, nor does it occur to them to fire Ferguson. So that's the incompetence hypothesis. Now, against the incompetence hypothesis, we have the Machiavellian hypothesis. This one says that Neil Ferguson is influential because he is corrupt, like his bosses in the UK government and in the World Health Organization. These bosses meant to create a mass panic and give themselves emergency powers. They needed a well-positioned and dishonest expert to gin up some phony catastrophe numbers and make the recommendation for draconian, coercive state powers. Neil Ferguson. Now, neither hypothesis is palatable. I fully see that. There's just no winning here. If this is incompetence, it is pathological, in fact, criminal incompetence. That means we are in great trouble. And if it's not incompetence, then we are in great trouble. Which is it? We must investigate. There's a widespread bias, I am fully aware, against Machiavellian interpretations, as if living in a world with a long history, millennia of abuses by the powerful, should naturally make us favor as the null hypothesis the claim that powerful people never conspire to do us harm. I think this bias harms science, and I've explained that in several articles on our Substack, and we will put those articles on the whole question of the narrative over conspiracy theory. We'll put those in the description as well. But I make you this offer. I will accept the unreasonably onerous burden of proof usually imposed on conspiracy theorists. I'll accept it if, in exchange, the Machiavellian hypothesis is at least allowed on the table. If this hypothesis can be considered, even with prejudice against the alternative, I call that a win for the scientific process, which must always banish dogma in favor of the free flow of ideas. To begin my presentation, I will make clear the sheer scale at which the first hypothesis must invoke incompetence. For only such incompetence as is almost inconceivable can explain Neil Ferguson's track record. And the same level of incompetence, I am afraid, must be invoked to explain Ferguson's bosses in the World Health Organization and the British government. Let's have a look. Since Neil Ferguson has a long track record and he has cried that the sky is falling several times, let us begin with the foot and mouth disease panic of 2001, which is the work of Neil Ferguson. In 2001, Neil Ferguson created a computer model that made a catastrophic prediction about foot and mouth disease, an affliction of domestic livestock. His recommended policy was kill them all. I'm not kidding you. And the consequence, because government apparently always does what Ferguson says, was a livestock apocalypse. Let me quote from one of the news stories on this. Quote, Ferguson was behind the disputed research that sparked the mass culling of 11 million sheep and cattle during the 2001 outbreak of foot and mouth disease. Charlotte Ride, a farmer's neighbor, recalls, I remember that appalling time. Sheep were left starving in fields near us. Then came the open-air slaughter. The poor animals were panic-stricken. It was one of the worst things I've witnessed, and all based on a model, ifs, buts, and maybes. End of quote. As you might expect, any such attack on British livestock had to devastate tourism, because tourists don't fancy a quarantined countryside replete with fascist vistas of soldiers and Land Rovers, rifles sticking out the front window, going up and down the lane, wantonly killing animals and breaking into the houses of terrified rural dwellers to shoot even pet sheep, disease-free, brought into the sitting room for safety. Tourists don't fancy a countryside blighted with sky-blackening pyres of animals being burned, the barbecue stench filling the air, causing smog so bad that children are forced out of school. Nor do they prefer the alternative stench experienced when, from the gargantuan numbers killed, the burning was delayed and corpses lay around in mounds for days. And these Dantean scenes, mind you, were unnecessary to fight the disease. For, as the government's very own foot and mouth experts pointed out, Ferguson's model was dead wrong. And I quote, for starters, the model failed to take account of the variety of farming practices, the varying rates of transmission between different species, and exaggerated the effect of windborne spread. End of quote. But not only was the model dead wrong, so was the policy recommendation. There was hardly any need to cull these giant herds because vaccines for foot and mouth disease already existed. In the Netherlands, Such vaccines were used in 2001 to control with success their own foot and mouth outbreak. Only 260,000 animals were slaughtered in the Netherlands, and even this was apparently unnecessary against 11 million in the UK, which means that Ferguson's recommendations on the response needed were off by one order of magnitude. That's not getting it wrong. That's being nowhere near the neighborhood of being right. Okay? He's useless as a modeler. If you're off by an order of magnitude, just your model is useless. Here's a graphical representation of the difference between the two numbers given by the area of the squares. Okay, the cattle slaughtered in the Netherlands and the cattle slaughtered in the UK, thanks to Neil Ferguson. Take a look at that. Take a look at that. And no part of that difference, mind you, can be attributed to the UK having more livestock than Holland, because Holland has the highest density of livestock in Europe, more than 4 times that of the UK or France. It is estimated this apocalyptic slaughter of cattle cost the British economy £12 billion. Now, here one might make the following two seemingly reasonable assumptions. You might say to yourself, well, UK bureaucrats had to be upset with Neil Ferguson for causing such harm to the nation, in particular to the rural citizens of Great Britain and to all those poor animals. And second, you might think, well, UK bureaucrats cannot be so incompetent that they cannot do the bare minimum required to give proof of a human capacity for learning. Those seem like two reasonable assumptions. And these assumptions together predict that even if, for whatever reason, authorities couldn't fire Neil Ferguson, still, UK bureaucrats would never again trust a catastrophic prediction from Neil Ferguson. That's what you would predict. And yet they did. Not once, but over and over again. So let us go to the next one. The next one was Neil Ferguson and the mad cow disease panic of 2002. The Spectator pointed out that in 2002, immediately after Ferguson's spectacular failure with foot and mouth disease, Ferguson predicted that as many as 150,000 people might die in the UK from mad cow disease. How close was he? In the UK, there have only been 177 deaths from mad cow disease. Compare those two numbers. 150,000 against 177. Ferguson this time missed it by 3 orders of magnitude. Then there is the swine flu panic of 2009. In 2009, Ferguson made another catastrophic prediction. This time, he forecast that the swine flu, AH1N1, would be equal in severity to the flu pandemic of 1957 and would therefore affect, quote, about 1/3 of the world's population, unquote, killing at least 2 million people worldwide, because that's what the 1957 flu is estimated to have killed. Now, these predictions imposed a special cost on my native Mexico. In an early run of lockdown policies, my country, considered the epicenter, was essentially ordered by the WHO to shut down lest the swine flu ravage it. We were ravaged by the WHO. 3 million people lost their jobs and the country went into recession. Tourism, Mexico's biggest source of revenue, took a nosedive. Total cost, $9 billion. It wasn't just Mexico. Ferguson imposed costs elsewhere because following his catastrophic forecast, his employer, the WHO, declared the swine flu a pandemic. triggering enormous government outlays in several countries for useless vaccines. And what was it all for? How big a deal was this? The official WHO, or World Health Organization, death toll was 18,500 worldwide. That's it. In Mexico, this quote-unquote catastrophe killed 1,172 people. To put that in perspective, consider that diarrhea kills way more people in Mexico. In 2016, for example, it killed about 4,000 people. Now, I have no idea whether health bureaucrats at the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, found these swine flu numbers embarrassing for being so much lower than Ferguson's prediction, and much lower even than any kind of threshold that might be considered a serious challenge for public policy. What I do know is that the CDC later produced quote-unquote new estimates that vastly inflated the number of alleged swine flu deaths. But even with these new numbers, even with these new estimates, the swine flu was still no match for the good old seasonal flu, which everybody considers just part of normal life. So once again, Neil Ferguson was completely wrong. Then there was the bird flu panic of 2005. Now, I know that this is not in chronological order, this item, but I left it till the end because in terms of impact, this was the biggest one before COVID, okay? This was just tremendous. In 2005, Neil Ferguson made the following prediction. He said that up to 150 million people, repeat, 150 million people could be killed from bird flu. This is 2005. How many people died? 282 worldwide between 2003 and 2009. Now, these numbers were reported in the National Review, and I've got nothing against the National Review, but they were attributing an insane number to Neil Ferguson. A number that even for Ferguson just had to be impossible. He couldn't have possibly said that. He couldn't have possibly said 150 million people, it seemed to me. So I went and checked. I went to the source, and it turns out that the number was wrong. The National Review was reporting the wrong number, but there was no relief in that because the number that Ferguson gave was even bigger. The mind boggles. Yes, the headline in The Guardian, the newspaper that interviewed Ferguson, did say, quote, bird flu pandemic could kill 150 million, end of quote. And that can explain why the National Review repeated that number. But in the body of the article, The Guardian quotes Neil Ferguson saying that 200 million people probably, quote unquote, would die. Probably. There was a bit of a panic. Bureaucrats began drawing up an European Union-wide action plan to prevent the spread of bird flu, and rich countries began stockpiling antiviral supplies. Britain announced 200 million pounds in spending on treatments for up to 14 million people and pledged to buy 2 million doses of vaccine for key workers. Sounding familiar? Meanwhile, in Southeast Asia, a regional plan was announced to combat bird flu. Yes, because Ferguson told the bureaucrats that a population 1.5 times larger than Mexico, the country, would die. How many did die? Less than 300 worldwide. That's just one extended Mexican family. This time, Neil Ferguson was off by 6 orders of magnitude. What? Is this even possible for a modeler who tries to do an honest job? Scratch that. Would a layperson guessing wildly get it this wrong? This makes me want to know Ferguson better. How does he think? Right? Because he's just phenomenal at getting it wrong. What makes him tick? How does he reason? How does he model? We are in luck because first Ferguson explained his reasoning to The Guardian. I'm going to quote him. This is Ferguson. Around 40 million people died in the 1918 Spanish flu outbreak, said Professor Ferguson. There are 6 times more people on the planet now, so you could scale it up to around 200 million people probably. End of quote. The population is now 6 times larger. Therefore, bird flu will kill 6 times the people as Spanish flu did. Spanish flu killed 40 million. So let's see, 40 times 6 equals 240. Yes, conservatively then, he was being conservative. The bird flu would kill about 200 million people. James Stirk, the reporter at The Guardian, didn't blink. So the incompetence hypothesis must extend its mantle imperially, stretching ever further to capture these so-called journalists. They're incapable of asking simple questions or doing the most basic research. Ferguson's calculation, or his pretense of a calculation, which a careless and hurried reader may perhaps consider to have any relevance at all, is entirely spurious, because the only assumption under which his reasoning makes sense is if bird flu is as lethal as the Spanish flu. And why would anyone assume that? Even if bird flu were a real human killer instead of a pathetic foe that at best can kill one extended Mexican family, still it could never be as lethal as the Spanish flu. Indeed, neither could the Spanish flu itself be as lethal in 2005, had it first appeared then, as it was in 1918. The Spanish flu wreaked havoc because it hit right after World War I, a conflict entirely without precedent for its destructive power. I think we have a photo there of Europe after World War I, Yoel, if you want to show it. People were already eating badly back then. War made that way worse. There was widespread hunger. Immune systems were shredded to pieces. Besides all that, medical knowledge and our ability to do emergency research on the fly were vastly inferior, and the resource for it were nil. The infrastructure, moreover, was badly damaged after the war. Indeed, as El Gato Malo argues more extensively, there is hardly any reason to think that modern humans are susceptible to devastating pandemics. Show them the article from El Gato Malo, please, Yoel. He makes this argument, right? Modern humans are not susceptible to devastating pandemics because we are tough cookies for viruses now. He makes a strong case that fatalities were so high during the Spanish flu due to medical error. Doctors not knowing what they were doing, yet very sure of themselves when poisoning their patients. Okay, there's a lot of new evidence about the Spanish flu that points in this direction. Only an epidemiologist with no knowledge of the historical context of the Spanish flu pandemic could possibly expect destruction on that scale for a new flu virus in the year 2005. But every epidemiologist is required to become familiar with the historical context of the Spanish flu pandemic. If this is incompetence, then how did a man with such a profound deficit become the most powerful epidemiologist in the world? But we have not, alas, yet plumbed the true depths of his alleged deficit, because Neil Ferguson's bird flu forecast smashed itself against the upper estimate for fatalities during the plague, the Black Death, the worst pandemic ever to attack humans. What was Ferguson thinking? Even if the bird flu had been an important human disease, which it isn't, this is not the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, people lacked an understanding of communicable diseases. Show them the Middle Ages, Yoel. People in the Middle Ages believed all sorts of counterproductive superstitions and did not yet comprehend the relationship between hygiene and illness. That relationship would be understood starting in the late 19th century, thanks to Dr. Semmelweis. In the Middle Ages, people just didn't understand this. In European cities, people huddled in small, humid, and cold spaces, stuffed with filth. In the streets were open sewers where rats flourished, infesting the whole scene, spreading their ticks to humans whom they bit and gnawed as they slept. These humans were quite vulnerable to Yersinia pestis, the guilty bacillus hitching a ride on those ticks, because their immune systems were trashed due to rampant poverty and bad diets. Yeah, there was widespread hunger in the Middle Ages. That's not our situation. Our problem now is obesity. So why expect bird flu in 2005 to kill so many humans as the medieval Black Death, the worst pandemic ever? Why would a world-class epidemic modeler, quote unquote, reason like this? Why would any epidemic modeler, any acquaintance with the Spanish flu and the Black Death, which an epidemiologist is professionally required to have, should have made clear to Ferguson what spectacular, outrageous nonsense he was talking? And the scale of this, Ferguson yelled Black Death and less than 300 people worldwide died. Isn't this beyond incompetence? I mean, is this even possible? But we are not done, because the incompetence hypothesis will make greater demands on us still, for it must answer another question. What about Ferguson's bosses? Imagine a car owner returning to the same company for a new car each time the previous car explodes. You buy a car, it explodes. You go back, you buy the same car, it explodes. You go back, you buy the same car. This is a pathologically incompetent consumer. Insane, really, incapable of making rational decisions, especially if this person asks each time for the same model and make that previously exploded. Should we reason differently when the product is epidemic modeling? Ferguson had repeatedly cried wolf. Scratch that. Ferguson had repeatedly cried infinite stampeding herds of rabid, deranged wolves. And every time, nothing. The cause of death and destruction on a scale to make one shiver had been not the diseases themselves, but Ferguson's policy recommendations. If Ferguson's problem was incompetence, his performance should have cost him his reputation and employment. Yet his every failure only seemed to whet his boss's appetite for more. Then came COVID, and bureaucrats once again turned to Ferguson. And they asked for the same model and make. The exact same computer program that Ferguson had been using for all his previous flops. Why do I say that? Because when people asked to see Ferguson's code, he explained in a tweet that he has been using the exact same computer program to model flu pandemics for the past 13 plus years, right? That's what he said in the middle of the COVID crisis. So he is repeatedly off by 1, 3, and even 6 orders of magnitude. Yet this does not convince him or his bosses that an entirely different model is needed. What would you conclude about government regulators and car company executives if, after a given model explodes on consumers, they all agree to return to the market in force the exact same car with no design changes? Wouldn't you conclude that they're trying to kill us? When the COVID numbers started coming out, demonstrating that Ferguson, as usual, was dead wrong, the bosses doubled down on, rather than abandon, his lockdown recommendations. Why? Why? Incompetence? Again? But even rats won't touch again a cage wall if an animal psychologist electrifies it. They learn. They're not geniuses. I'm not saying rats are geniuses. I'm saying they're capable of learning from experience. They have operant conditioning, which is one of the simplest forms of learning, and it's quite sufficient for all kinds of learning tasks. One wall of your cage is electrified and it gives you a nasty shock. Well, guess what? I won't touch it again. You don't have to be Einstein. You just have to be a laboratory rat, and you'll get it right. What's the matter with the people in charge? One touch of Ferguson should have been quite enough. You don't want to get zapped again by this guy. At least not if you're interested in people's health, which is what the bureaucrats at the top of quote unquote health ministries are supposed to be interested in. So you have to, in the incompetence hypothesis, you have to stipulate that Ferguson's bosses, the world's most powerful people, because they can literally stop the world and did, right? Ferguson's bosses, the world's most powerful people, are stupider than a lab rat. That's what you would have to be saying under the incompetence hypothesis. And that places you in an unsolvable paradox, because now you, even if we provisionally agree to consider this ridiculous incompetence hypothesis, once you consider it, you realize now you have to explain how these morons who cannot tie their shoes ever became so powerful. So by trying to solve the problem of what happened in COVID with the incompetence hypothesis, you generate another problem, which is equally or just as big or even bigger than the problem you were trying to solve. That's no hypothesis at all. That's quicksand. It's quickly getting you in deeper and deeper trouble. Okay. A hypothesis is not useful if it creates bigger problems than it solves. It is perhaps time then we considered a more sinister possibility, that Ferguson's powerful bosses are not incompetent but skilled, and that Ferguson has been giving them precisely what they want. That's why they keep going to the same trough over and over and over again, even though Ferguson is always wrong. They want him to be wrong, says the Machiavellian hypothesis. Okay? They want him to be wrong. That's the product. Being wrong is not a mistake. That's the product they want. That's what they keep going back for. Why? Because Ferguson is always crying that the sky is falling. He is Chicken Little. And by crying that the sky is falling, he gives the people who run the world the expert analysis they can use to impose on everyone totalitarian policies of control. They imposed lockdowns on us that abolished our freedom of association, our freedom of movement, our freedom to work, our freedom to travel, our freedom to eat in a freaking restaurant. And even more seriously, they absolutely shredded to pieces the Nuremberg Code. The Nuremberg Code was elaborated after the trials of the criminal Nazi doctors at the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal. Those criminal Nazi doctors were experimenting on death camp prisoners as if they were lab rats. They were torturing people to death in medical experiments. And they all hanged, because that is a crime so atrocious that the people responsible must be executed. Nothing else can be contemplated. They must be killed. So they were. They all hanged. Well, that's the kind of crime that world bosses imposed on us in the COVID crisis. It's the same kind of crime. They forced on us, because they did force on us. I didn't allow them to inject me, but a lot of people were coerced in various ways to get injected. They treated us like cattle or lab rats or slaves. All of those apply, because we lost sovereignty over our own bodies. And that is the condition of slavery. When you cannot refuse a needle, you are a slave. You are cattle. That's what they did to us. Those people are not going to hang. They're not even going to be tried. They're not even going to testify. Only Anthony Fauci is testifying. Where is Neil Ferguson? Where is Bill Gates? We will have more to say about Bill Gates in our next installment on this topic. I will explain how Bill Gates took control over the entire health establishment, the pharma establishment, and how he managed the entire COVID crisis by managing our reality. If you want to be in the Q&A, there's always a Q&A after my podcasts. Please go to Substack. The easiest way to do it is just go and click on the article we have on the front page, which is about today's podcast. And you go to the bottom and you will see how to become a paid subscriber. And then you have access to our Q&As. They're always a lot of fun, and we get to go more deeply into the weeds in all of these topics. And I share with you all kinds of things that I don't share in my podcast. So if you want to come find out all my dirty secrets, come to the Q&A. Thank you for coming today. Remember to subscribe, like, share, most of all, share. Bring us many more customers to our English YouTube channel, and ding that bell.